Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I'm just going to record one quick little video. Not introducing too much new today. I'll save that for Wednesday. But I just want to give this week talking about applications of GIS. So I just want to show you one way that I'm personally using GIS. I'm going to be talking about something that's quite painful today, incidents of police involved deaths and police killings. So I just want to give a content warning. Nothing that I present here in this 10-minute video is going to explicitly be on the exam. So if anyone finds this subject matter just too difficult to engage with, don't feel compelled or obligated to watch it. That said, I'm just trying to show a diversity of applications for GIS. We've gotten some introduction into, say, some technical applications, say with like hazards planning in Module 5. This one is more an emphasis on how GIS can be a powerful tool for promoting social change, and also talking a little bit about how I've been using open source GIS. So everything that I'm presenting is done in Python, for instance. So police violence is a really severe issue in Canada that doesn't really get talked about anywhere near as much as it does, say, in the United States. But the reality is that racism is very deeply ingrained in the history of Canadian policing, especially for the RCMP, who have played a central role in Canada's ongoing genocide of Indigenous peoples. They work to actively oppress BIPOC communities and, broadly speaking, maintain systems of oppression throughout Canadian society. Police institutions really exist to do the bidding of those in power, not really to protect the public. And so it's my perception that over 7 years living here now, Canadian institutions, especially policing institutions, but more broadly just Canadian institutions in general, tend to rely on a lack of race-based statistics and other demographic information to perpetuate this narrative that systemic racism is just an American issue and that Canada is somehow better. I know as a white settler, an immigrant from the US, I certainly fell for that, didn't question it for some time, but the reality is that it's a severe issue in Canadian society. It's not like colonialism stopped at the 49th parallel. And so it needs to be discussed in more broadly in Canadian society in order to hold Canadian institutions to account. So just a quick note on terminology. Two things that this focuses on are police killings, which are any death resulting from an interaction with police, or any death resulting from police use of force. And then there's police involved deaths, which is a broader term, which is any civilian death at the hands of police, which includes police custody, police negligence, suicides, overdoses, medical emergencies, on top of police killings. And so this is a broader term that's more difficult to refute on the grounds of semantics. And oftentimes the police don't actually release the cause of death. They use obscurity and lack of information to try and hide the truth. But the reality is that there's been a severely increasing trend in police violence, especially in recent years. The earlier portion of this record may be partly due to lack of access to information. But in the last 5 years or so, we've seen a sharp increase in incidents, despite being in a pandemic and lockdowns and things like that. There's still been a really severe increase in the last 2 years. And it's not a spatially equal distribution. If you look at the raw numbers, that's obviously going to be skewed by the differential populations of the provinces. And so this highlights the importance of data normalization, for instance. And if you calculate the police violence rates, you find that they're much higher in the West and the North, particularly. The North is severely, disproportionately impacted by this issue. And so this is a data set that I've created from a handful of different data sets. And it's publicly accessible here now. My goal is to get it to a point where it's more broadly accessible. There's still some work to do, it's a work in progress, but I plan to work to get it a little more well-rounded in the analysis, and then share it with media organizations. And ideally, the goal is to work to address this issue and get the government and police institutions to actually do something about it, because it's quite obvious that the government and police organizations broadly are quite satisfied with the status quo and have no desire or motivation to do anything about it. And so one thing that I'm going to talk about on Wednesday, and so this is just an example of that, is the concept of positionality. So to be as ethical as you can in your GIS practices or your academic or work practices more broadly, it's important to think about positionality. And positionality is just who you are and how you relate to the work that you're doing. And so it's important to be transparent and upfront about this kind of stuff. And so this is just a rough example of a positionality statement with talking about my motivations in relation to this work. So for instance, at 19, I was charged with possession of a controlled dangerous substance. I was arrested for 0.5 grams of marijuana in the US. And prior to that point, I didn't fear the police. I wasn't raised to fear the police. As a white person with considerable white privilege, I was, shielded from that harassment, whereas many children of color have, their parents have conversations with them, telling them, like they have to fear the police, and, all those, like, I never encountered any of that. That said, after being labeled a criminal, I did get some glimpse at how police treatment differed. Multiple occasions, I was pulled over and detained without cause while police brought in dogs to search my vehicle because I had an arrest on my record. And so there's a variety of different ways that the police will group and categorize people and treat them differently based on certain circumstances. On one instance, I was approached by a police officer. He had his hand on his holster, and he was ready to draw his weapon. And very possible that if I were of a different skin color, that pistol could have been drawn and I could have been shot. So I certainly have some personal inhibitions and distrust of the police that are in some way motivating my work here. That said, once I moved to Canada, my crime wasn't a crime anymore. And, I fell for that narrative that police violence isn't a thing here. I thought, this place is better than that, but couldn't have been farther from the truth. I fell for the narrative that these institutions have crafted, but the reality is that police violence is just as pervasive in Canada as it is in the United States. And so my motivations for creating this database are to address that issue and work to end police violence. And so the point of positionality is that it's a good idea, or it's best practice, to disclose who you are in relation to your work. The idea of objectivity, I think, is a complete farce. No one is completely objective. Depending on the field you're in and what you're doing, the level of objectivity you may have might differ. Like if you're in chemistry, maybe you're more objective than if you're in, say, a social sciences field. But even so, if you're a chemist, you may have a particular attachment to a particular theory, or say you worked with somebody who set up something. So your supervisor used to be so-and-so. Like that even is important. So nobody is purely objective, but especially working in the humanities and social sciences, it's especially important to address your positionality, but it's more broad than that. So this is still very rough. It's a work in progress. This is just volunteer work that I've been doing on my spare time. So I'm just going to give a broad overview of a little bit of the data set and talk a little bit about it. That said, there's some people who are working on this for their final project, so I'm not going to go too deep into it. But between January 2000 and this should be updated to November of 2021, the police killed over 1,100 people. The largest proportion of that has been like direct use of force, police shootings and other types of killing, but there are many other deaths that are involved. Where 16% of the people killed by police are in relation to police chases, and many of those weren't even the intended target. It's just bystanders who are killed by high-speed police pursuits. There are many overdoses, suicides, and things like that in police custody as well. Now, the biggest issue with this, one of the biggest issues with this is that the demographics are severely skewed. The killings by police are often racially motivated, and police bias plays a considerable role in this. And so also they don't report the demographic information for the overall significant majority of victims of police killings. But with that said, you can use data normalization techniques to highlight that even given that, there's still severe disparities here. So if you, for instance, get the national demographics data, you can use data normalization to highlight the severity. Because if an uneducated viewer looks at this, they might take this to say that systemic racism and police violence is not an issue. They might say white people are the majority of victims of police killings, which, while true that they're the largest number, they are by no means most severely affected by it, because approximately 80% of Canada's population is white. And so you can get demographic information, and this highlights the importance of data normalization, to highlight just how severe the disparity is, especially for Indigenous and Black individuals. If you take the rate just of white individuals, you see it's less than 7-fold as much as the rate for Indigenous people. But even if you sum the rate for incidents for white individuals and all of the individuals for which the race is not specified, of which a large majority of these are probably racialized individuals as well. Even if you do that, just based on the reported statistics as they are, the rate for Indigenous individuals is still grossly disproportionate. And there are other disparities in this data set as well. I'm not going to get into too much of it. Another key point to this work is to work on advocating for accountability and attributing blame. So as of 2017, because one of the data sets that incorporated this had information on whether officers were charged, only 3% of officers had been charged with a killing. And so this, again, highlights a severe issue here where police just get away with killing people without any sort of repercussions at all. And even more broadly than that, regardless of whether an officer is charged with a crime, whether an individual is held accountable, these departments and institutions are directly responsible for the deaths of large number of individuals across the country. And it's important that that is more widely known, especially the RCMP. They are the overwhelmingly responsible for the large number of deaths. And so one of the things that I'm working on now is spatial attribution of these incidents. So I've used geocoding, the technique that I showed you all last week, using Python and Mapbox to provide spatial attribution for these incidents. It's an ongoing process. I'm still working on tracking down a lot of the information here. But the goal is to take this spatially attributed data, match it up with census data. And so then, for instance, you can account for the large number of unknowns, say for the demographic information, because you can say, just look at the number of incidents per census unit relative to different demographics within the census blocks themselves. And so I'm not going to go too deep into this, but this data set is a compilation of a large number of other data sets. It's actually based on work that was done by the CBC, but the CBC has been very obscure in releasing their methods. They haven't said how they compiled the data set. They wouldn't actually share the data with me. I obtained it from a different source. And their data set's highly flawed. It's missing a large number of records, for instance. So I've incorporated other data sets. This is like a WordPress blog, for instance, and I wrote a Python script to scrape all the posts from this blog and parse out information and add it to the database. And so it's still a current work in progress. I'm working on expanding this database, but I just wanted to record this quick video to just show a possible application for GIS that doesn't have any, say, economic or financial motivations behind it. A large number of the applications for GIS are government and industry related, and I'll talk about some of them on Wednesday, but there's much more that can be done with it beyond just like the pursuit of profit.